My name is Alara Quinn, and tonight I am standing in the doorway of the bedroom I was never meant to belong to. The house is silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ribs and asks whether you're ready for what comes next. A soft lamp glows on the nightstand, throwing a warm halo across the man sleeping in the center of the king-size bed. Gregory Hale. My husband. The man who built an empire commanded rooms with a single glance and believed control was his birthright. He looks different now, stripped of the masks he wore during the day. Without the tailored suits and the calculated voice, he lies there with his breathing uneven and his hand twitching against the silk sheets, as if even in sleep he is fighting a battle he can no longer win. He doesn't know I'm watching him. He doesn't know what has been set in motion. He doesn't even know this is the night everything finally turns. I step closer, letting my fingers brush the cold brass of the bedpost. The air in the room is heavy with the scent of expensive cologne, and something older fear, maybe, or the faint echo of a man who can sense the walls closing in without understanding why. I used to think fear made people fragile. Now I know it exposes them. It reveals how much they've taken for granted and how blind power can make someone. Gregory shifts slightly, his brow tightening as if somewhere inside he feels a truth pressing against him, begging to surface. I watch him swallow hard and whisper something I can't quite hear. Maybe a name. Maybe a plea. Either way, he has no idea I'm the one he should be afraid of. When I first stepped into Gregory's world, nothing about it felt like it belonged to me. The chandeliers, the marble floors, the hush that followed him. They all reminded me I was an outsider, invited in for reasons more complicated than affection. It was a cold Manhattan evening at a charity gala I had no real place attending. I still remember the hum of conversations, the weight of my borrowed dress, and the way my hands kept searching for each other like they were looking for escape. Gregory saw me before I saw him. He sat near the front, surrounded by people who owed him something. When our eyes met, I couldn't tell if he saw a woman or an opportunity. What I did know was that I needed a lifeline, a way out of the crisis swallowing my family, the debt, the pressure, the hospital bills that never stopped arriving. Every door felt closed until he offered a smile built from the confidence of someone untouched by consequences. Our first conversation felt practiced on his end and desperate on mine. He asked about my work, my family, the things I cared about, not to know me, but to map me, to understand the limits and vulnerabilities of someone he might one day control. I sensed it even then, that subtle pull from a man used to acquiring what he wanted. Still, I agreed to see him again. Not because of charm, he didn't have the kind that made you blush, but because being with him felt like choosing survival. I told myself it was temporary, a transaction shaped like romance, something I could keep contained. But you don't contain consequences when the other person feeds on control. They become the room you inhabit, the air you breathe, the quiet compromises you make to keep the world from collapsing. Eventually I learned the truth. Gregory never wanted a wife. He wanted ownership. The night everything shifted began like any other, quiet, predictable, arranged around the routines Gregory believed kept the world in his control. He'd taken his medication early and fallen asleep halfway through the documentary he insisted we watch. I stayed beside him until his breathing settled, then slipped out of bed to clear the glasses on the nightstand. His phone buzzed once, a brief vibration that could have blended into the hum of the air conditioner. I told myself not to look, even as the screen lit up, casting a pale glow across the room. I wasn't searching for secrets, but the preview lingered there like a tear in the fabric of our carefully silent night. "Miss you already. Tomorrow can't come fast enough." The sender was just an initial R. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Gregory wasn't affectionate, not even with me, so the intimacy felt absurdly out of place. Then the phone buzzed again. And again. Before reason caught up, I picked it up. Threads of messages, spilled open pictures, plans, hotel rooms, conversations he had while I sat across from him at dinner, or waited in the car outside his office. 2 years. It had been happening long before our wedding, before my life became bound to his. The shock didn't strike like a blow. It seeped in cold and steady. I didn't feel jealousy or heartbreak, just a sharp, sudden clarity. Gregory had never loved me, never cared enough to pretend well. I was an acquisition, a symbol, a convenience. The messages didn't expose betrayal. They confirmed his arrogance. He believed I would never look or suspect, because to him I wasn't someone with the right to question him. I set the phone back exactly where it had been, the screen fading to darkness, as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. and so would I. I didn't confront Gregory the next morning. I didn't throw the phone at him, demand explanations, or let anger spill out in ways he could twist against me. Instead, I woke up before Dawn brewed coffee in the quiet kitchen and let the steam rise in front of me as if it were drawing the outlines of the path I needed to take. My hands were steady. My breathing was calm. It was the first time in months I felt something close to control. If Gregory could hide an entire relationship for 2 years, then he wasn't nearly as careful as he believed he was. And a man who isn't careful leaves traces. So I started small. I didn't dig through drawers or snoop through files like someone desperate. I simply watched him more closely than before. His tone during phone calls, the pauses between his sentences, the way his fingers tapped the table when someone mentioned audits or contracts. Each reaction told its own story. Within days, I began to see the patterns. His business empire, so polished from the outside, was held together by shortcuts he'd taken for years. Deals secured through favors instead of transparency. Partnerships built on shaky trust. Financial reports that looked too perfect to be real. He thought those secrets made him powerful. He never considered they also made him vulnerable. The real turning point came when I met Lucas Brandt. Gregory introduced us at a dinner, proudly presenting him as one of the sharpest legal minds in the logistics sector. Lucas shook my hand with a polite smile, but something in his eyes shifted when Gregory stepped away. Later, as we stood near the balcony, he made an offhand comment about the messiness behind success stories. It wasn't gossip. It was a warning disguised as small talk. I realized then that people around Gregory weren't loyal. They were cautious. They stayed close because distance could be dangerous. They smiled because stepping on his pride could cost them. And that meant something important. I was not the only one who saw the cracks. Over the next weeks, I let conversations flow naturally. I asked questions that sounded harmless, let people fill silence with truths they didn't intend to share. No manipulation, just patience. I learned how Gregory routed money through smaller subsidiaries, how he pressured mid-level staff to sign documents they didn't fully understand, how he dismissed Marion's concerns about quarterly discrepancies with the same arrogance he used on me. Every detail was a thread, and I began weaving them together into a picture he'd never expect me to see. I didn't need to expose him. His own actions would do that. All I had to do was position the right pieces close enough that when one fell, the rest would follow. One night, as I walked past his study, I heard him cursing under his breath, the frustration in his voice sharper than usual. It told me the storm was already building, even if he didn't know where it was coming from, and for the first time since marrying him, I felt something dangerously close to power. The unraveling began quietly, too quietly for someone like Gregory to notice. The first sign came on a Tuesday morning when he stormed into the kitchen, already dressed for the office, his shirt collar uneven, his tie slightly crooked. Gregory was meticulous about his appearance, so the disarray alone told me something had happened. He muttered under his breath while scrolling through his phone, his jaw locked so tightly I could see a vein pulsing near his temple. I kept my back turned as I rinsed a glass, letting him believe I wasn't paying attention. He preferred when I looked harmless. It made him careless. By noon, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Gregory paced from room to room, alternating between harsh phone calls and long, trembling silences. I caught pieces of his conversations, words like timeline liability, unexpected audit, and withdrawal. Someone had pulled out of a major deal. Someone else had flagged an irregularity in the quarterly reports. And worse, a government agency had requested documents he thought were buried under layers of corporate insulation. He kept insisting it was a misunderstanding, but Gregory didn't believe in misunderstandings. He believed in control. And suddenly he had none. Marion arrived later that day. She rarely visited unannounced, but her expression told me she wasn't there for family pleasantries. They argued behind the closed doors of his study, voices sharp and muffled, rising and breaking like waves crashing against cliffs. I stayed in the hallway, pretending to look at a vase, letting the echoes carry toward me. Marion was demanding answers. Gregory was deflecting, blaming staff, accusing auditors of incompetence. Nothing about the conversation sounded like a man still standing on solid ground. By evening, he was unraveling faster than the empire he had spent decades building. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Partners wanted meetings. Lawyers wanted statements. And in every conversation, Gregory used the same strained line, "We'll fix it," as if saying it enough times could make it true. I watched him pour himself a drink, hands shaking slightly as he tried to steady the bottle. He almost never let me see him drink out of stress. To him, vulnerability was something to be hidden. That night, he didn't bother hiding anything. When he finally looked at me, his eyes carried something I had never seen before. Not anger, not pride, not suspicion. Fear. Raw and unpolished. "Do you think someone's behind this?" he asked, voice low, almost fragile. The question lingered between us like smoke. He searched my face, waiting for reassurance, searching for the version of me he believed he'd shaped, a quiet wife who stood still when storms gathered. Instead, I stepped closer, resting my hand lightly on the edge of the table. I think I said softly that things fall apart when they're built on the wrong foundation. He stared as if trying to understand whether I meant more than I said. I knew he was moments away from seeing the truth. Gregory barely slept that night. I could hear him shifting beneath the sheets, waking every hour to check his phone, his breath catching each time a new email appeared. Dawn crept slowly across the room, washing his face in a pale, exhausted light. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked smaller than the world he'd tried to command. He sat at the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as if the grain of the wood might offer an answer. I watched from the doorway, the same place I had stood on the night everything began to change. The symmetry of it wasn't lost on me. When he finally lifted his head, his eyes found mine with an expression I had never expected to see from him. Unfiltered, unguarded fear. It clung to him like a second skin. "Elara," he said, my name breaking slightly on his tongue. "I think someone is trying to bring me down." There it was, the realization he had dreaded the moment he could no longer pretend the storm gathering around him was just another business inconvenience. He reached for me, as if I were an anchor in rising tides, not knowing I was the tide itself. I walked toward him slowly, each step steady, unhurried. He straightened as though bracing himself for comfort or reassurance. But I didn't offer either. I stopped just a breath away from him, close enough to feel the tremor running through his hands. "Gregory," I said, keeping my voice calm, almost gentle. "Things don't fall apart because of enemies. They fall apart because of truths." His brows pulled together, confusion tightening the lines on his face. I could see the moment his mind began to reach backward through every conversation, every glance, every time he underestimated me. The pieces were there. They always had been. He had simply refused to see them. I didn't need to confess anything. I didn't need to raise my voice. I only needed to let him understand that the collapse surrounding him wasn't an attack from the outside. It was his own empire folding inward, the weight of his secrets finally too heavy to bear. He inhaled sharply, realization flickering behind his eyes like a candle fighting to stay lit. I held his gaze, letting the truth settle between us. And in that quiet, breaking moment, he finally understood who I had become. When Gregory finally looked away, something inside him seemed to loosen, as if the truth itself had stripped him of the last piece of armor he'd been clinging to. I didn't say anything more. I didn't need to. The moment had already done what months of planning could never fully accomplish. It made him see me not as a possession or an extension of his own power, but as a force he had never accounted for. I left the room before he could speak again. The hallway felt strangely quiet, softer than it had ever felt during all the months I'd lived there. I walked past the framed photos of his achievements, the shelves of awards polished to a shine, the architectural grandeur he used to assert his place in the world. None of it looked the same anymore. It all felt like a shell hollow, ornamental, already cracking. Outside, the early morning air was cool against my skin. A pale strip of sunlight stretched across the driveway, catching the edges of the hedges he kept trimmed with military precision. I paused for a moment, letting the silence settle, listening to the distant chirp of birds waking to a new day. It struck me how different the world looked when you were no longer bracing for someone else's anger, expectations, or control. I didn't feel triumphant. Revenge isn't a victory march. It's the soft exhale that comes when a weight finally slips off your shoulders, leaving you lighter than you remember being. It's clarity, not celebration. As I stepped off the porch, I realized I wasn't running from anything anymore. I was simply walking toward myself, toward a life that had waited patiently on the other side of fear. And for the first time since I married Gregory Hale, I knew I was free.